drinking if you want, but according to Jessica, we can start because she's recording this, I think, for people at home. I've alluded to it already several times. Bullis, the seat was in this, and we have subtitles as well as translation on everything. It's 10 minutes long. But Bullis was one of my seminarians way back in the, I think right after I got ordained, so probably be somewhere between 86 and 94. He's been ordained probably close to 20 or 25 years. Most of his time as a priest has been in the Diocese of Minia, which is about 3 to 4 hours south, by train anyway, of Cairo. And it's, as I might have alluded at one of the Sunday Masses at least, it's a hotbed of sectarian violence. And the big thing is, Bullis, who I have a picture on, she saw it, a picture on my phone when he was a seminarian. I used to call him my choir boy. But he was not famous for being overly smart. He was kind of below average. He also has bad eyesight in one eye, and his bishop at the time, who eventually became a patriarch and a cardinal, when he was still a seminarian, said, Bullis, you know, you're really not too smart. You're really not good eyesight. If you could find another bishop to take you, fine, because I really don't want you. And I was kind of his unofficial spiritual director, like I was for so many others unofficially, and then eventually became official starting in '99. Anyway, I kept telling Bullis, I said, don't make it easy on them. If they want you out, let them throw you out, but you don't leave, because they're trying to discourage you and make you decide to leave. So he gets ordained, and he gets involved with this prison ministry. He's got, that's why I call him a choir boy, even though he's got this beard now. His eyes give him away as somebody who's really warm and loving. And so anyway, he got into the prison ministry, and at first he was just catering to the Christian prisoners, usually more the Catholic ones than the Orthodox. And he was so thorough because he got funds from different people, including yours truly. And so the Muslim prisoners and their families started saying, well, Father Bullis, can't you do for us what you do for the Christians? And he said, well, I probably could, but I'll end up in jail with you for proselytizing. So he actually found a Muslim sheikh, and he's in it, Abdul Rahman. And they got into this team ministry, and then they got the congregations from their church and the mosque into team ministry, serving them. And then they got another priest and another sheikh, Abdul Khair, who was a more recent student and spiritual directing of mine, as well as Mahmoud Doma, another sheikh and another congregation from a mosque. The reason why I'm stressing this is because they're even under fire from both sides for supposedly crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed, because we're supposed to hate one another, or at least not associate. But, you know, it's his mentality, the people in these two churches. After Morsi was overthrown and we had the second revolution in 2013, starting at the end of June and going right through into August, there was a dispersal of demonstrators that didn't like the idea of overthrowing Morsi after only a year. And so they went around almost all over the country, and they burned courthouses and police stations, and they also burned about 73 days churches, rectories, convents, and schools. What they never showed, though, was where the religious leaders, Muslim and Christian, Orthodox and Catholic, had good relations with one another, and the people followed suit, is there was no destruction of property or life in those villages. Well, what happened is some of the ones, like I call them the vigilantes from neighboring towns, would come into the peaceful ones and try to do what they'd done where the things weren't that great. But whatever was shown in the news or in magazines or in newspapers is where the relations were good. The good Muslims that had good relations actually locked arms, standing around the church compound to keep the fanatics from a neighboring village coming in and breaking and gutting and burning. Another thing I said is I find spirituality versus dogma and religious teaching brings people together, because I find even with Muslims and Orthodox, I can always share my faith in God, and that's what they do, acknowledging but not focusing on the difference between Islam and Christianity, Orthodoxy, and Catholicism. So I don't want to talk anymore. We'll start with the film, and again, you're free to leave afterwards if you want to stay for an extra 10 or 15 minutes and ask questions or make comments. I'm not punching the clock. I got 2 more days before I leave. So if Jessica could start the film, and we could turn off at least the lights at this end. But the first time Bullis gave me a copy of this, It's on YouTube now, so you can watch it again or show it to somebody else if you ever want. But the first time he showed me this, because I was so proud of what he had done in this film, I actually broke down and cried, you know? So I try not to do those things anymore. So it says a story of friendship. Originally it was called Watching the Inspired. This starts with something known. January 7th is their Christmas. And so this is January 7th, 2011, right before the first revolution. It started on the 25th. And somebody, this is up in Alexandria, on Christmas Eve, as they had planted a bomb in front of the church. So we start with what most of us expect, violence between Christians and Muslims.
أنا اسمي بولس نصيف.
That gets louder with subtitles in just a second. That's a typical village scene along the Nile.
I'm a priest at the Coptic Catholic Church, and I'm responsible for serving the disadvantaged groups and the groups with special needs.
My name is Sheikh Abdul Rahman Hassan Al-Ammar. I am the first supervisor and coordinator for the call to Islam in the area of Mini.
The collision between Christian and Muslim cultures is perhaps greater in the Middle East than anywhere else in the world. While Egypt's recent political upheaval has occupied the headlines, religious tension and conflict has continued unabated. In his work as a prison chaplain, Father Boulos has faced the challenge of providing support to prisoners of different faiths.
In the beginning, the prison fellowship group Jesus the Prisoner was serving Christian inmates in prison, and the Muslims were not getting the support that the Christians were getting. The Muslim families started coming to the church to request support in the same way that was given to the Christian families. So married women started coming. And here in Egypt, it's a bit sensitive to have Muslims coming to church. It causes a lot of doubts. But at the same time, if you want to follow Christ's model, he did not refuse anybody, and he was going to serve everybody. We needed to be able to serve everybody without creating all the sensitivities about the Muslim coming to the church. In Egypt, we are people who come from various backgrounds. There's a lot of religious extremism. People are very conservative. People are quite fixed in their thoughts, in their faith, and are quite closed up. I was always looking for a sheikh with volunteers who would work with me in the same spirit as Jesus the Prisoner and serve the Muslim families.
We were walking together, and everybody was amazed how we, a Muslim clerk and a Christian priest, walked together. People were looking at us because this is not a very usual sight.
It was important for us to make it clear that the intent of them coming to us and us going to them was not to convert them, but the intent was to come together to be able to serve the poor, the needy, the families of the prisoners. We started discussing together and finding out what are the basic principles and values that unite us and that make us work together in the same ministry, in the same mission. All of this process was quite challenging And there were a lot of risks because people were looking at us with a lot of suspicion. Muslims and Christians sitting together raised doubts from both sides. They couldn't understand why we would be together.
Despite suspicion and concerns from Christians and Muslims in the community, Father Boulos and Sheikh Abdul Rahman started a volunteer group called Hand in Hand, helping support inmates and their families with schooling, financial support and social activities.
We're having an excursion, an outing for the families, and eventually we came to a church. A little Muslim girl did not want to go into the church. She said, I have been told at the mosque that if I go into a church, then I will die. So there were a lot of suspicions and a lot of prejudice that we had to overcome. It took a lot of prayer and a lot of preparation.
It's mainly love that binds us together as Christians and Muslims. This is the thing that really unites us and makes us one and makes us able to serve and do the ministry.
We do not come as Christians. We do not come as Muslims. We come as people who belong to the same humanity.
What is unique is that we have an interreligious volunteer group. We could have some volunteers working in the church. We could have some volunteers working in the mosque. But having a group of volunteers coming together because they believe in the same cause, in the same values and principles in Egyptian society, this is a very unique experience. This has never happened before. We are all brothers.
In the hand-in-hand group, we can see the person and we become friends with the person, and him being a Christian or a Muslim is not the real issue.
We would meet sometimes in some of the areas where there is a lot of tension. And we would walk together, me and the Muslim Sheikh, and this would cool people down because they can see that there is no animosity, there is peace, there is friendship between us as persons, a Christian pastor and a Muslim cleric.
Extremists from all sides, they have so many arguments, but when people see us together, then this calms everybody down and gives a very different impression.
This is Father Anton, who's deceased now. He was about 9.
For the Christians who think that the Muslims are enemies, first, they don't know very well their faith, they don't know their Christ, and they don't know their gospel.
Many changes have happened within the group between Christians and Muslims. This has created a whole different culture. We have even started visiting each other in our homes.
The Christian group would come to the Muslims during their feasts, and the Muslims also would go to the Christians and visit them during their feasts. There's no hypocrisy. It's all very genuine and very transparent.
I can say that Father Boulos is one of the closest and most faithful friends that I ever had.
We are now much more friends than co-workers. We even share in our personal lives, in our family lives, and visiting our respective homes. This is a beautiful relationship.
Father Boulos is a very special person. He understands very well the challenges that he is posing, because many of the Christians are saying, why do we need to help those people, to serve those people? They are persecuting us.
If you really believe in your faith and the message you want to bring, your words and what you do should not be theoretical. You should go down to the field to the places where people are in pain and are in need. This is where you will find the real meaning of what you believe in.
We should take the initiative in building bridges, especially with the Muslims. We are living among them and with them. We are a gospel, we are a living gospel, we are an open gospel.
كلمة التسامح تشمل كل شيء.
Forgiveness is the basis of all religions. It will conquer any problems, any quarrels between any groups, and it will show that there are no barriers separating the people of Egypt. Once we have forgiveness, everybody can.
Anyway, this is the end of the film, so it's not the end of the world. Anyway, before I say anything or make any comments, I'd like to start with the film if you have any observations or comments. And I'll try to respond to those. And then if you have anything over the last 3 days you'd like to say or ask questions about, feel free. So do we have any questions or comments about the film, starting with that? Yeah, please.
So the Muslim sheikh, does he have a family?
Probably that woman that did the speaking was probably his wife. Okay, because there's an expression, and even the Latin bishop used to use it sometimes, saying, why are we celibate? Because he was a Franciscan, but he used to, in Islam, there was a thing called Zawag Nusadin. Marriage is half of religion. So celibacy is not considered advantageous or a virtue or anything else. And then something that's a little on the side, in the Coptic Orthodox Church, and even in most of the Eastern Catholic churches, celibacy is considered part of a monastic vocation that has nothing to do with a clerical vocation. So as a spiritual director, one of the things I was trying to do among seminarians who chose celibacy was to try to help them integrate these two separate vocations. Celibacy, which is monastic, as well as priesthood. In the Coptic Orthodox Church, if you are to be a pastor and not be in a monastery, they will not ordain you until you are married. It's mandatory marriage to be a pastoral priest in the Coptic Orthodox Church. It's an option in the Coptic Catholic Church. About half of the 22 Eastern rites have optional celibacy. But you have to choose it ahead of time. In the Coptic Catholic Church, you have to be married at least 5 years before they would consider ordaining you, because they want to make sure your marriage is stable first. Okay? And but the Coptic Orthodox, and then the other thing which I don't have, which obviously Bullis has, and most Orthodox priests and Catholic ones, is the beard. You know, because they'll say to me, you know, how can you be a priest? You don't have a beard. Now there's 2 or 3, either because they can't grow a beard or they're Westernized that don't want a beard, the Catholic ones, not Orthodox. And then quite a few of the Byzantine priests versus the Coptic ones are clean shaven. But they have the option of beards. But no, in Islam, they usually are married with families. Anyway, I think I gave you more than you bargained for. Next question? Anybody? No?
I have another question.
I'm sorry?
So did you make friends with like a Muslim sheikh when you were there?
Well, a couple of sheikhs, but more fairly well-known Muslim lay people. I was part of a group that discussed things. It was more academic, though. It wasn't really grassroots. My biggest experience for 2 years, between 88 and 90, I taught English for nursing studies at the Al Fallujah Nursing School, which was 100% Muslim and 100% Palestinian. And when I first got there, I was down having tea with a couple of students in the cafeteria, and this one veiled Muslim Palestinian girl came up and she said, I don't particularly like your president or your country, and we'll wait and see about you. And I went like this, and she said, you bow to nobody but God. And I said, okay, anything you say. But one of the things is they hated fakery. They would rather have integrity and honesty and an outright drag-out fight. I mean, at least twice, once in each academic year I was there, we had screaming matches with each other. But it was always kiss and make up afterwards. And that's Middle Eastern culture too. I don't know if I had told Deacon Frank this story, but one time coming back from Arabic studies near Tahrir Square, which is where a lot of the demonstrations was, but it was also the old main campus of American University Cairo. I got on one of these buses where it was only a 35-seater, and anybody who bought a ticket, because it was more expensive, had to have a seat. And this is an example of the Middle Eastern way of things. So anyway, there were 35 people sitting, and there were only 34 tickets sold. So the bus driver walked around and said, "Who hasn't bought a ticket?" Nobody says anything. So he says, "Okay, I'm walking around, everybody show me your ticket." So one guy didn't have a ticket and hadn't said so, so he says, "Stand up," and he headbutts the guy. And they're literally both drawing a little bit of blood on the forehead here. So anyway, they're driving back to where I was going to get off in Masr Gadida, which is Heliopolis out by the airport. And everybody in the bus, because it's the same way with a car accident or anything else, everybody else is getting in this discussion. Who was at fault? Should he bought a ticket? Should the other guy have head blocked? Blah, blah, blah. Turns out where I was getting off the bus, the guy that didn't have the ticket is getting off the bus, and the driver sees him getting up in the rearview mirror. Stops the bus, puts on the emergency brake, and stands up, and I go, "Here we go again." But in true Middle Eastern spirit, the bus driver says to the guy, "Malish," which is, "Don't worry about it, it's forgiven." They shake hands, give each other a hug, and kiss each other in both cheeks. That's the Middle Eastern way, and that's why you get attracted to it, because it's so contradictory, it's so paradoxical, but that's the culture. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, please.
Well, not so much about the film, but were you ever afraid when you were there?
To be honest with you, no. And one of the things, because for over a decade, no, about 7 years, I should say, I used to bring roughly 3 seminarians to the States every year. It was partly because some of my parishioners in my expat parish were U.S. Embassy people. So if I didn't get what I wanted the first time around, because sometimes in the interviews they get turned down, so I'd pick up the phone, and I was spiritual director for the visa officer for one, and I'd say, "Hey, Stephanie, what the hell's going on?" So she'd say, "Look, I know what you're going to call me about. I know why you're upset. I'm going to do an override." So they all ended up getting on a plane and coming to the States. But when I used to answer your question, when they were in the States, I used to have to keep telling my guys, "Now you're not in Egypt. You can't be out in the dark. You can't walk around without worrying about getting mugged." Okay, Cairo has 22 million people, and I used to walk back alleys, dimly lit, sometimes way after it was dark, like at 10, 11 o'clock at night. Never once thought I was going to get mugged. Yeah.
Several years ago, we were on a tour, a mission trip in the Holy Land, and our guide was a Palestinian Christian.
Yeah.
And in regards to Muslims and Christians and Jews, he said that some years before, things weren't as bad as they are now as far as the distrust.
Yeah.
Did you? As things became more polarized, did you see?
Oh yeah.
That it's worse now than.
It's probably, and I have to be careful because Deacon Frank and I have already struggled with this conversation because I stay over at his place. And over at Mike Miller, right? Last name Miller? We have a Mike Miller as the principal at Asheville, so I'm always afraid I'm saying his name by accident. Anyway, I have a film in the car. I've got 3 copies. It was made by one of my parishioners, Yasmin Perrine, who happened to be the wife of Ben Wiedemann, who used to be the #1 CNN reporter for Middle East. Anyway, I've known her for a long time. She gave me 2 copies, and I have an extra copy. I got 3 copies, but it's called The Stones Cry Out. And it's the plight of Palestinian Christians over the decades since the establishment of Israel in 1948. And as a process too, it also, and this is the sensitive part, exposes a lot of the shenanigans of the Israelis when it comes to human rights for Palestinians, both Christian and Muslim. And I was there for the first Gulf War for the last 3 weeks of it, the 6-week Gulf War. I was there from mid-January through February when it ended. And I just said something once on Facebook yesterday, the day before. The last objective news, network or cable, that we have had in the United States was Walter Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley. There is nothing reported by anyone that's 100% objective and not spun. every single station. Because I could literally sit in Egypt during the Second Revolution and watch Euronews, Sky News, and BBC, which were British, and then I could watch Fox News, CNN, and then OAN hadn't started yet, and Newsy and whatever the other one, Newsmax, hadn't started yet. But the renditions they gave were just obnoxious. And when I was in Israel during that first Gulf War, the misreporting of that was phenomenal, including CNN. So, I mean, it's a hard topic to start, but all I can say is, when I was a kid and through my seminary days, Jack Kemp was my congressman. I come from Western New York. And my mother had received a letter from me during one of the skirmishes between Lebanon and Israel, and this was just before Sabra and Shatila, in the refugee camps. And so I wrote my mother, and my mother was a person who never backed off. I mean, occasionally she would get up and because Jack Kemp was her best friend's next door neighbor. So one time he came to our town, she grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and said, "Hey, you need a haircut." But anyway, at this time I read the letter home, and she actually stood up at a town hall meeting that was having in my town, and she read this letter. And so he proceeded to send me a letter congratulating me on my work in the Middle East. And then he said, continue to make your family, your country, and your church proud of you. And I wrote him back and I said, I'm not doing it for my family, my church, and my country. I'm doing it because I think this is what is right, and I wish you'd do the same. But I actually invited him, using my ordination money, to come and me give him a tour in the Middle East, and obviously he didn't take me up on it. But seeing is believing. You have to experience, not as a tourist. Mark Ellis, who was a professor of justice and peace and eventually became the chair of religions, and he's a Jewish guy from New York. I've known him since 1980. And anyway, he went through a conversion experience as a New York Jew, thanks to a Canadian Mennonite named Kathy Bergen, who took him on settlement tours to see the way the illegal settlements were basically a land grab, pushing Palestinians off their land. And he got to meet, through Kathy, all these Palestinian families. He did a total about-face. And even Jewish Voices for Peace do the same. But the biggest thing is, like I said, the news here is totally spun and unreliable. And you basically have to, I don't know how you do it, I honestly don't. Because everything seems to be slanted in a certain direction. And until you see it and experience it, you would have a hard time changing your opinion of what you've been fed over the decades here. So, yeah.
In this situation that's shown in the movie, the unity of the two, of the Muslims and the Christians, is through the ministry of prison.
Yeah.
You were saying that other villages also had good relationships that they had built. Do you know what sort of grounds those people had come together? Was it similar?
It's usually the initiatives of the religious leaders. They set the environment, and people usually follow suit. So, for instance, not his, in fact, it's a different diocese even. It's called Ozarabi, and I have pictures, on my phone. And even the military and the police usually try to intimidate ministers and priests, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, and they always try to get in the way when there's any kind of physical improvements to the compound. And generally speaking, if a policeman or a military guy knocks on your door, you start shaking because you think you're getting arrested or beat up or whatever. But Ayman, who is another, I talked to him this morning on the phone, he's in the Sud Diocese, this is in the Mini Diocese, but anyway, he also has met not only the Muslim sheikh and some of the Muslim elders, the Orthodox priests, but very often the army officers, are banging on his door, and not to cause trouble, but they want to come upstairs, have a couple of cigarettes and a couple of cups of tea, and they'll show up about 10 o'clock at night. We're lucky if they leave by 2 in the morning. But literally, I have a picture where we're holding hands and holding arms, okay? But you have to get out of your comfort zone on both sides. And almost like what some people have said about Arabs and Israelis. Before the first Intifada, which I think was around, I'm thinking it was around 88, I'm not sure. Because it happened after my first trip, and that was 88. And before the different Gulf Wars and the second Intifada, Israelis and Palestinians had more or less figured out how to live with one another. But then we had Shamir, and we had Netanyahu, and we've had Sharon, and those guys just rubbed the noses in. I mean, like Sharon got an apartment in the Arab section. Hardly ever used it, but anybody who lived in that area had to go through security every time they went in or out of their house that they'd lived in all their lives, because Sharon had ordered the fact that his place had to be secure even though he never stayed there. So it was kind of a harassment thing. But I can remember when I first went, because it was before the Intifada, and it was fairly common to see Israelis and Palestinians as friends. And the year I did Christmas masses for the peacekeeping forces, which was December of 93, straight after the signing of the Oslo Accords. Linda Breyer, who was an Israeli lawyer, was a friend of mine. She invited a New Year's Eve party, and they were various Israeli settlers originally from France and whatever, and a few Palestinians, a couple of them who had actually been in Israeli prisons for one reason or another. And again, if you just let them work it out, they work it out. And so we had a great party that night, no fights, no screaming. And another example, I know the author because I met him over there, but then I've also stayed at his house in New Orleans. His name is Tony David. And he actually gave me and autographed the book. It's called An Improbable Friendship. And it's about the decades-long friendship, if you can pull this one off, between Moshe Dayan's wife. And Moshe Dayan was one of the most avowed persons that would just assume, like with Arafat, shoot him is look at him. And Yasser Arafat's mother-in-law. So you have a Palestinian Christian, because Yasser Arafat married a Christian, and Moshe Dayan's wife, and they, for decades, had this personal friendship. They were both strong women, like I said about Middle Eastern women, and they would argue and fight, scream at each other sometimes on the telephone, saying, look what Arafat did, look what Dayan did. But the two of them never let that get in the way of their friendship. So there's the paradoxes of the Middle East just bottom the line, okay? Even during the first Gulf War, you'd have to keep a scorecard to figure out who was sleeping with who in the political sense of the word. Because you never... Yeah, anybody else with questions? Okay, I guess I've worn you out. Go ahead.
In a number of countries, you have ethnic groups living peacefully.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, something explodes, and they start turning violent one against the other. And that's what, in a sense, happened in most of Egypt, except in those villages where there was close friendship.
Yeah. We used to refer to Egypt as a Rumbuba Fintazar Kabrit, the gas bottle waiting for the match. Okay, because you put a match by a gas bottle and the valves open, kaboom. Okay? And it's very much of a nervous, on-edge society. And, you know, when when Morsi became president in the Brotherhood, it was almost like, because we'd always had a relatively secular country in Egypt. It was phenomenally secular if you see the old Egyptian movies during the time of King Farouk and Al-Gamal and Nasser. The beginning of it becoming Islamicized, as Deacon Franks heard me say, because they had edited a book on Article 2 of the Egyptian Constitution, a couple of years back. But Sadat, to try to have an open-ended presidency, which is what Sisi's trying to do now, started to cater up to the Muslim fundamentalists more than fanatics. So he just changed an indefinite to a definite article. Instead of the Article 2 of the Constitution saying the principles of Islam are a source of jurisprudence, he changed it to our source of the source of jurisprudence. And just doing that was the beginning of the Islamicization of Egypt. If you see movies from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you would think it was, you know, obviously they were speaking Arabic, but it could have been Europe or the States, okay? You know, I saw There was something like the Brady Bunch with Omar Sharif's ex-wife, and it was like the teenage girls were wearing miniskirts, sleeveless dresses, short dresses above the knee. Now, over a period of like 50 years since Sadat's time, you go to the ocean in Alexandria or the Mediterranean, and you'll never see a two-piece bathing suit, which you saw 50 years ago. And a woman, she basically goes in fully clothed with ship-ships, which are like, what do you call them, shower clogs. And she's totally covered, because if she didn't, you'd probably have a riot on the beach. And there's a few private guarded beaches where secularized Muslims and westernized Christian women can still go and wear bathing suits. But the transformation of the country into a very conservative, traditional Islamic state, even when I was there in '82, it wasn't like it is now. Okay, and it's kind of sad, because almost worldwide there's this tendency when you feel insecure to, let's say, hey, we knew black and white, good and bad, back in the days when somebody, a religious leader or political leader, just said this is the way it is. We didn't have to think, But, unfortunately, with free thinking, and if you don't have the formation, education, content with methodology to back it up, you feel insecure, so you start going back to when we were black and white, people just took orders. That includes this country at times, too. But, because I would go back and forth, the satellite dish and the internet has done a job on Egypt. Like one of the nights I think I talked about, the world would stop with Falcon Crest. They were absolutely addicted to Falcon Crest and not landing. And until the Egyptian government started censoring and took it off the air, Dallas was the favorite. Because they're utterly fascinated by these things. But here's the other thing, is they're very gullible. They actually think that's reality for America. For what it's worth, I don't know how many times I've had to tell Egyptians, because they're addicted to professional wrestling, that it ain't real. And they'll say, it is real. Look, this is a melodrama of actors. It's entertainment. It's not real. And they still struggle to say that realize it wasn't real. And it's the rumor capital of the world, okay? Because one of the things we're dealing with is education. Most education in Egypt, unless you got the money for private schools, which are usually Jesuits, Sacred Heart Sisters, Good Shepherd Sisters, whatever, is, public education is crowd control. There's maybe 60 kids in a classroom, nobody's studying, nobody's paying attention. This is somewhat at the university or at least high school level too. Cheating is rapid. There's no such thing as study habits. You memorize and quickly forget anything for an exam, and what you haven't memorized, you just cheat. Even in military academies, this is the case. And it's sad because about 45% of Egyptians are illiterate, and another 20% are almost functionally illiterate in the sense that maybe they can read, but they don't read. So you only have about 35% that actually read and maybe to some degree critically think and don't just believe in the last rumor they heard. Any other questions, or we'll just let it go and let you go? Once again, I just thank you for everything. And as I said when I was in the church, I forgot to thank Deacon Frank, because he really, between my legs and everything else, he's the one that's kept me going and kept encouraging me. And occasionally we've had a few little discussions where we didn't agree on things. And then, Mike here in the middle, I would be here if he hadn't approached Dickie McGee at Maryknoll, and Dick approached me, and then maybe approached Father Cummins. And anyway, here I am because of that. So again, I thank you all. Did you have a quick question, then we'll close?
A quick question about the Mass.
Yeah.
I noticed that you have a cross.
Yeah.
That you hold most of the time.
Yeah, until we get ready for the consecration, the priest holds
and
it,
then you
puts
put
it down. Yeah.
So, I was trying to figure out what the special significance of that is.
It's almost like you feel like you forgot to pull up your zipper if you don't have it. Unfortunately, that's the best analogy I can have. You feel absolutely naked without it if you're in the Eastern Rite, okay? But again, it's a symbol of Jesus and his authority. But once you actually confess the Eucharist, or start to, then it's the real thing and not the symbol. Okay, so that's kind of it.
Yeah, I kind of wondered about that. Is that, I mean, you are in the place of Christ,
Yeah,
basically, until that point.
yeah.
And then Christ.
But everything is, I mean, everything in Middle Eastern is phenomenally, again, it's symbolic. Like if you remember in the old days, we had the manna pool in the Old Testament, for those of us old enough. And some of the new guys want to go back to all this stuff. But if you ask them what that was for, they'll say, well, we wear it. Well, what was it for? They honestly don't know. Originally, but it became ornamental, it was this. Just like the amethyst that you wore underneath your L was because ring around the collar when you're in climates is rampant, and it's much easier to wash a piece of cotton like this with a couple of straps than a whole vestment. Okay, that's why some of the old vestments too, like the stoles, used to have a little piece of white lace loosely sewn that you could take that off and wash without having to wash the whole stole. The chalice veil, we basically had something close. Again, before you had air conditioning, and when you didn't have screen windows, and the doors were open, the windows were open. And I've seen it literally in Egyptian churches. It's infested with flies. You got this baldachin, which is like an arch thing on 4 pillars over the altar. You got birds' nests in that. And so you got bird droppings and flies in your wine, and flies and bird droppings on your host. You know, and I mean, these priests we have to consume everything, even if it gets contaminated. So, but what I'm saying is a lot of stuff was very functional.
Yes.
Just like a lot of the vestments we wear were actually originally came from pagan Roman senators. That was what they wore.
Yes.
Or from Jewish priests and things. But none of it really originated because Jesus never wore a vestment. You know, he wore a tunic. And the other thing, too, always to remember, I might have referred to it, is they didn't sit around a table. They sat around a tablea that was probably about 2 feet off the floor. They were reclining with their head aimed at the table, all around it, and their feet were up the other way. And so, and I did this at a Bedouin thing in Wadi Rum in Jordan one time. And then you basically reach over like this, lying on your side, and either just grab whatever you want to eat, or you take a piece of bread, like a pita bread, and you kind of like, your fingers are kind of like a vice, and you don't do it directly with your fingers, you do it with the bread, you grab some and then you put it in your mouth. But even if you, and I might have referred to this, like the sinful Mary, because my big thing is decoding this stuff. How could she have sat behind him, or stood behind him, with her tears falling on his feet, if she stood behind him sitting, because it would have fallen on his shoulders? And so the place where if you're not worthy for anything, you would never come up to a person's face or head, you'd be down by his feet. And so she was standing behind him when he was reclining so that her tears could fall on his feet. You know, and then therefore too, when she kneeled down and dried him with her hair, again, his feet were sticking out from the opposite end of the table. But you know, those are the kind of things you have to get in touch with, because so often we have concretized the way we say liturgies, where if you get into the first and second century church, a lot of the stuff that we considered, especially pre-Vatican II, that was so sacrosanct, you know, I mean, I'm happy to see mainly people receiving in the hand, and for what it's worth, the ones who think it's more reverent, again, don't know their history, and some will say the history is fake. But for the first 4 centuries of the church, when it was underground, the only way of receiving was in the hand. And you did ritual ablutions, just like the priest at the offertory, to ritually purify your hands. The other thing is, there was no such thing as regular Eucharist. That came with Pius X. There were all these ritual purity laws, fasting from different activities and different foods. And you had, you know, we had more or less the habit of having to go to confession, you know, before, again, to be ritually purified. But confession was not something regular, which is part of the reason why exposition of the Blessed Sacrament came. You know, because in a way, exposition is a vestigial organ for the fact that with frequent communion, you become the tabernacle. That's why I've never understood it. For what it's worth, the head of liturgy in Washington agreed with me. But sometimes they'll say, get up, or kneel down. And I'll say, why? The tabernacle door is still open. I feel like saying, you fool, you're the tabernacle, you just received the Eucharist.
Well, you know, that became really important to people because we had the enforced 10-week Eucharistic fast during the lockdown last year.
Yeah.
And the only thing we were really allowed to do was Eucharistic adoration.
Yeah, well, that's why it was a valid reason.
Yes.
I'm not a big fan of exposition, but I went to Father Patton, called me just before the Mass, and I've got a beautiful picture on my phone. We have a daily Mass chapel with 4 clear panes of glass. And behind the daily Mass altar, we have a beautiful fresco of either the Resurrection or the Transfiguration. Anyway, me of all people said to Pat, I said, the people are being deprived of liturgy, Eucharist, and they're being deprived of receiving communion of the Eucharist. I said, if there was ever a time to have exposition of the Blessed Sacrament, now is it. This is the real reason why it started in the first place. So we put the monstrance in the clear glass window. Somebody's got a picture I could show you on my phone if anybody's interested, because when it's lit up, it looks like the monstrance, the Eucharist, is right coming out of Jesus' chest with that background of the fresco. But people literally, continually, well, if the weather's nice, they kneel on the grass in the garden in front of that window. They sit in their cars, sometimes for up to 1 hour, doing whatever rosaries or other devotions and prayers in front of that window. And it's the most incredible. It's been there for a year and a half. We only move it on Sundays because we have Mass and it's not supposed to be exposed when you have Mass. But it's an incredible thing. And like I said, somebody took a picture, and we've been using it for posters and everything else because it's such a beautiful, inspiring picture. But that was the origin, and we just rediscovered our origin during the pandemic. Up until now, it's been almost in a way, it's become kind of a cult. For one thing, in the Eastern Church, they don't do it, except some of the priests that have been Romanized that are using wafers, because we use leavened bread. We don't have tabernacles, except if they have a few wafers for whatever reason.
How do you reserve then for the sick?
Well, that's it. They visit the sick the same day as the liturgy.
Oh.
Because Jesus is as hard as a rock within 6 hours of putting him in the tabernacle. Okay? When we get into this thing of receiving from the chalice during flu season, my classmate who was on the Zoom meeting today is a medical doctor, graduated from Cornell Medical School. And some people say we should not be afraid of receiving the blood of Christ. Okay?
Yes.
And Peter, who's very black and white, says, I'm sorry, but the blood of Jesus in this case is only 12% alcohol, and if there's a virus, you're going to catch it from Jesus. So, I mean, every once in a while you have to, some people felt that if we're doing the right thing, we wouldn't get sick.
Oh, okay.
Damien the leper, and one of our guys went to his canonization, worked with lepers in Egypt for 15 years and in China for 5. If you expose yourself to that virus by being careless, you're going to get leprosy like Damien got. And good intentions don't help. They just make you a martyr.
Wow.
Anything else?
Thank you.
Not that I've scandalized all of you.
How long did it take you to learn Arabic?
If you want to be honest, I'm still learning and I still make mistakes and I still get laughed at because I mispronounce certain sounds. But I basically studied International Formal Arabic 3 years. 1 year at the Pontifical Institute of Arab Islamic Studies in Rome, which drove me crazy. And then 1 year at American University Cairo, and 1 year at the Cambodian Institute. And then 6 months of colloquial spoken Arabic at the International Language Institute, ILI. Probably what helped me get it is I was one of the few guys that got into this whole issue of total immersion. Because I went to places where nobody spoke a word of English to me for months. And then when I was at the seminary, I had to attend at least 3 hours of meetings every week in Arabic. And I had all sorts of different things because I was on the priest council that I had to read in Arabic. I'm not very good at oral reading. I have to rehearse it because they have an expression in Arabic. You don't read Arabic to know, you have to know Arabic to read. Unlike Spanish or German. Like for instance, when I do the Spanish Mass, because I just studied it when I was like 68 years old, I can read it because I was taught how to pronounce it. In German, it's pretty much what you see is what you read as long as you know how to pronounce, like anything that's I-E is E, anything that's E-I is I, things like that. But the big thing, in Arabic, you can have a word that looks identical and it might be be pronounced two different ways because it has two different meanings. But the only way you know how to pronounce it is the context in which it's used in the sentence. So if you don't understand what you're reading, you cannot read Arabic. You might read it silently and figure it out as you're going along, but you can't read it out loud extemporaneously. Now, an Egyptian who's native born can do that quick, because it's like a computerized mind. But for somebody like myself, it's Dick and Jane even after 3, 4, 5 years.
Well, thank you.
Spoken is easy, but the reading is tough. Anyway, thank you all again. I hope that at least this made your mind think a little bit, especially about Islam. As I say, there's 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. If they were all kind of our stereotype heroes, we'd all be dead by now.